got a wonderful wine tasting set up for you all tonight. I'm the beverage director, as you guys remember me, beverage director for WineStyles Tasting Station. We are visiting a winery from a region that is not probably on many people's radar, so to speak, but it's one that I think is certainly up and coming. But most importantly, it's with some of our longtime partners in crime, Old Bridge Cellars. I know we have Laura here. Perhaps maybe Chris Rowe might be jumping in. He's a familiar face usually on a lot of these tastings as well. But Old Bridge Cellars has been a very, very, very long time partner of WineStyles, both in our wine club programs, in our winery spotlights, and things that are exclusive to WineStyles. And once again, we're very ecstatic to be having this opportunity with a wonderful winery, with an awesome winemaker as well. Obviously, he's drastically different time zones, so we had to make sure that worked as well. And we're happy to have Joel here with us and Laura. Joel, why don't you take it away, talk us about the wines? I know you have some slides and things like that. As a quick reminder, everybody, if there are questions, we definitely appreciate those. Just shoot those in the comments. I'll do my best to facilitate those as we go through here, but we'll be tasting some amazing wines as we go through. And questions, comments, observations, just props to the wines themselves or the winemaker, those are always appreciated as well. So with that, I'll hand it over to Joel, and he will introduce himself and talk us through this wonderful winery and his lineup of wines.
Thanks for that, Jeff. Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining in on the call. As Jeff said, it's about 9 o'clock in the morning over here, and I guess it's about 6 o'clock at night for you guys. So slightly different time zones, but we can always make it work over a glass of wine. I don't sort of want to do death by PowerPoint, but I've got a couple of slides that I thought might be useful just to introduce Tasmania, because that's the wine region we're going to focus on primarily throughout this tasting. And it's a fairly unique and interesting and emerging sort of wine region for the Australian wine industry, and obviously for the worldwide sort of style of wine. So I wanted to run through a couple of slides, give you a bit of background on that. Please feel free to throw anything into the chat, sing out with any questions and comments. I want sort of my commentary to be as relevant and interesting as it possibly can be. And then we'll work through the wines. We've got 6 wines from our portfolio to taste today. I think the tasting order's in the chat alongside there, and you've got access to that information. So if you're keen to get started on that, please feel free to pour the first wine. But we'll focus the first few minutes just talking a little bit of background about Tasmania. So I might just share my screen. Also, just by way of a very brief introduction, my role, I look after, I head up our winemaking function for a company, Brown Family Wine Group. So we're a family wine business, been making wine in Australia for over 130 years. And as part of that group, we've got 2 brands in Tasmania, Devil's Corner Tamar Ridge, and a brand that's home in the Yarra Valley. But we make wines from both the mainland of Australia and from New Zealand, and we'll have a look at our New Zealand Pinot Noir later today. I'll give you a little bit more context to those brands as we go through, but that's us as a business. And probably just to get started, I said we've been making wine for 130 years, always based on the mainland of Australia. Just prior to 2010, actually, so about 13, 14 years ago, we were talking as a business about the long-term sustainability of the Australian wine industry and wine production in general. And one thing that really stood out to us in a changing climate is where the opportunities to make the very best wines may exist moving into the future. And there was a little bit of wine starting to get made in Tasmania, which is that, for those not particularly familiar with geography around Australia, that's that little island about 240 kilometres or whatever that is, just under 200 miles south of the mainland. It's a small island surrounded by sea, and it's very, very much a cool climate compared to the rest of Australia. We can just see on the heat map there, that's our maximum summer temperatures through January, which is the height of our summer. And it just tells you those purple and red colours indicate really hot temperatures, and the greens and blues and yellows are much, much cooler temperatures. So you can see, just looking at the chart, how much cooler Tasmania is compared to the rest of the mainland. And that's really what drew us to Tasmania as a region, thinking about the next 130 years of wine production in Australia and what might give us the very best sort of opportunity. Within Tasmania itself, on the right-hand side there, that's a little map, and it highlights some of the sub-regions that are starting to emerge in Tassie. So we've got 2 sites depicted by those blue stars there, 2 vineyard sites, one at the north of the island in the Tamar Valley, and another vineyard on the east coast on the sort of right-hand side there. There's a couple of other regions that down south, the Huon Valley, Derwent Valley and Coal River Valley. For those a bit more familiar with Tasmania, may have come across some wines or some wine brands from those regions, but they're the main areas. The rest of the state, particularly the western side, is too wet and cold for grape growing, and through the middle of the island, there's a lot of other general sort of agriculture, but there's a lot of frosts and it's very cold through those areas. So we need the coastal influence to moderate temperatures. And just a bit of context, I've put growing degree days there, and we don't need to sort of worry about the technicality of those numbers, but I just wanted to give a little bit of context when I say that Tasmania is a cool climate place for growing grapes. What's that really mean? So I've showed, on the mainland of Australia, where our higher volume wine production is done in areas like the Riverland. That's the warmest example there. We've got Napa from the States is pretty similar to, say, the Barossa Valley from mainland Australia. And then we move down and get a bit cooler. And you can see down at the bottom, the east coast of Tasmania and the Tamar Valley are very, very cool sites and pretty similar to Champagne in France. So we are not only sort of growing grapes for great sparkling wine in Tasmania, but also making table wines. We're focusing on Chardonnay and Pinot Noir table wines. So we're growing them in a very cool site and growing them in a site that we think is really future-proof for a changing climate. And we believe that's where some of the best Chardonnay and Pinot Noir production is going to occur over the next couple of generations. And I just wanted to, sorry to sort of bore you with more facts and figures, but I just want to give a little bit of context about the relevant size of the Australian wine industry and Tasmania, because I think it's worth sort of understanding that this is quite a boutique and emerging region. So Australia makes about 4% of the world's wine production. So that's a little bit under half of what's made locally in the US. You can see the big hitters there, France, Spain and Italy, but a bit under 4%. Of the Australian production, Tasmania is just 1% of the Australian production. So we're 1% of the 4% slice of the pie. So it's a very much a small and emerging region, and we're one of the major players down there with our brands, Devil's Corner and Tamar Ridge. But yeah, it's still very much small production, small volumes of production. And in Tasmania, about half of what is grown down there is Pinot Noir, and the other major variety is Chardonnay, which is no surprise. They're the varieties we're focusing on today. And about half of the total production down there goes into sparkling wine and the other half into table. So that kind of sets the scene a little bit. I hope that's giving you a little bit of context without boring you too much on Tasmania. I just wanted to elaborate a little bit further, if I could, with a quick flyover, and we'll see if this works okay on everyone's screens. But this is a Google Maps sort of flyover of Tasmania. It just shows our vineyards, the location of our vineyards, and so I can talk a little bit more about the island as we go through, and given its actual Google Maps imagery or Google Earth imagery, it sort of gives you a little bit more of a real context of the sites we're talking about. So we're heading south towards the northern part of the Tasmanian island, so from the mainland of Australia. And we see the Tamar River coming in there, and this is our Cayena vineyard. So I said we had 2 vineyards. We've got the Cayena vineyard at the north of the island, and this is about 130 hectares, which I think calculates out to about 320 acres in your language. And this is one of our sites. It's actually where we have the oldest of our vines, which in Tasmania are not particularly old, but they're around 20 years of age, 20 to 25 years of age. And our main winery site is located here, so you can see the winery building in the middle around the dam, and then a flyover of our various vineyard blocks. Lots of different aspects in Tasmania, and as we sort of we spend a lot of time working out exactly what clones and what varieties are going to work best for, at certain aspects. A lot of our best table Pinot Noir comes from aspects that face to the north. So in Australia, that's giving us additional heat generation and warmer sort of sites. And as I said, given it's such a cool climate down there, getting the additional warmth to ripen up table Pinot is really important. Just flying over the Tamar River here. So this is the Tamar River is a really important climate factor for us in the Tamar Valley. Right up north of the island, there is the windiest and most exposed part of Tasmania, and the winds are very cool as they rip off the Bass Strait, and we're exposed to the roaring 40s trade winds that operate right around the globe. And they're always coming off the sea, so there's a lot of cool wind that influences the climate. That proximity to water, close proximity to water in the Tamar River, has a moderating effect on the site and enables us to avoid too many particularly cold nights and frosty nights, which is important for our wine production. And we're just moving further down through the midlands of the Tasmanian island now across to the east coast. And this is our other vineyard and the larger of the two. This is 200 hectares under vine at this property, which is about 500 acres. So this is our largest site, and our two vineyards in Tasmania are two of the largest. So we have a significant holding down there, and certainly a big part of investment for our business. The important part about the east coast here, again, really close proximity to water. You can see how close we are to the sea and that big sort of molting lagoon. So that again has quite a moderating effect and helps us to avoid frosts and really cold sort of temperatures at night. Our vineyards spread over a really large area here, as we've got about 5,000 acres of land and about 500 under vine. So you can see that again, we've been really selective as to where we plant our grapes, and to make sure we've got the very best sites. Okay, I might jump out of that video now because I think it's probably time to taste some wines.
Don't hit the leave function. I've done that before.
Yeah, no worries. How are we going, everyone? Have we got any questions or any insights on that, or we want to just get into the wines now?
Let's jump into the first wine. I mean, I'll have some questions. I'm sure others will have questions as we go through there about the, soil types and geography specific to the wines and the areas we're at. Yeah,
perfect. Okay, so we're going to kick off with our Devil's Corner Chardonnay. So I think you've got the 2021 vintage Chardonnay here. So we're going to see two tiers of our wines as we work through the Devil's Corner range, and then the Devil's Corner Resolution range, which is a premium step up across the Chardonnay and the Pinot, and then we'll change brands and change tax. So the Devil's Corner wines, really the heart and soul of what I'm trying to do with these wines is represent the quality of the fruit and the regional expression of Tasmania. So these wines are made from a winemaking point of view. These wines are made with fairly minimal winemaking input. We do a lot of fermentation in stainless steel tank. There are some barrel inclusions in the Devil's Corner core range, but largely it's about expression of that fruit and the quality and purity of the fruit that comes out of Tasmania. And that's something I've had the privilege of making wines from a number of different regions around the world. The one thing that really stands out for me in Tasmania is the purity of the acid and the quality of the fruit expression in the wine. So with the Devil's Corner range, from a winemaking point of view, it was a case of really not stuffing that up, making sure that fruit really sort of sung in the wine. So 2021, starting to get a lovely little bit of bottle age and maturity in it now. As you taste through the wine, citrus dominated. We've got some light white florals and stone fruit sort of notes. But the main hallmark of this wine, as I was trying to talk through, is this slaty mineral texture that comes from the acidity on the palate. So it's a really fresh, bright, crisp style, works well, versatile with or without food. Great sort of seafood wine, great summer wine. And because it's not overtly heavy or, burdened with too many secondary winemaking sort of characteristics, a whole lot of oak, et cetera, it's a really, really bright, fresh sort of wine that you can consume quite comfortably on a summer's day without food as well. It can just be a nice, refreshing drink.
Aside from obviously the shorter growing season and I'm assuming some pretty huge shifts in temperature different times of the year, what are the other kind of major challenges about growing and making wine in Tasmania?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's probably, no, it is actually. It is the most challenging wine region that I've ever worked in Tassie. I've talked a little bit about cool climate. We talked about wind, those sort of things. The extremes we get climatically in Tasmania are more extreme, I guess, than anywhere else I've worked or made wine or been exposed to in the world. And what that does, it's got, as much as anything, I think it can be explained in the variations we even get in yield. So we can get a threefold variation in yield. We can be as low as 1 tonne an acre, or as high as 4 tonne an acre in various seasons. So it's probably approaching a fourfold change in yield, which is really challenging to manage, and that is all climate led. So we actually had this season, for example, was particularly challenging down there early in the season. It was particularly on the east coast. It was the coldest and wettest spring that we've had for 130 years, which made so it tests out our ability to grow grapes and our resilience as a viticultural and winemaking team. We had fairly challenging conditions through flowering, so naturally a low yielding sort of season. But then our challenge becomes, how do we make sure we've got balanced vines and we're making sure we're producing quality wines out of those kind of challenges. We've ended up with a fantastic result from a quality point of view. The accountants hate me at work because the cost of fruit has gone through the roof this year because the yields were light. But the challenge in Tasmania is adapting to the climatic conditions we get. We can have periods of time where it's exceptionally windy and exceptionally cold and wet right when you don't want it to be. We can have periods of warmth and drought, and we've in the 13 years that we've been making wine down there, we've had 3 or 4 years where we've been challenged for water, for irrigation, and we don't irrigate a great deal, but it can be exceptionally dry for extended periods of time, particularly on the east coast. And we've had periods of time where we've been every couple of weeks we've had to get excavators in and rebuild the headlands and roads so we can get access to our vineyard site, because it's been so wet that we've had roads and stuff wash away, and that's all happened in a very narrow space of time. So for those of you that have looked online on the WineStyles sort of site, there was a little video clip. There's some imagery and market imagery about the wild and ruggedness of Tasmania. sometimes you see those things as a marketing positioning sort of tool, but from a winemaking perspective, that's not me. I'm not a marketer. I'm a winemaker, and certainly I see the absolute extremes of climate down there, which makes it really fun to make wine. And the biggest role we play is understanding the seasonal conditions and using the tool we have to adapt to those conditions and produce the best possible wines.
I was going to ask, given your choice between the huge extremes and changes on a probably yearly, weekly, and sometimes daily basis in Tasmania versus wine regions that are, almost to the degree, what degree it's going to be on a July 5th, you prefer the craziness of where you're at?
I do. I think that's where the creativity comes in. That's where if you're sort of truly passionate about making wines, then sort of facing into those challenges is where it becomes really, really sort of fun and engaging. And I think Tasmania is going to be like that for an extended period of time, where we're on the edge. Years like we've had in the last couple of years, we've had some blocks that are just, it's too cold to ripen them. So we've had to make some sparkling wine out of wines that we had earmarked for table wines because the season was too cold to ripen the fruit, which is a unique sort of challenge. And then we'll have years over the time where it's they're warmer years and drier years, but you can't do anything the same. You can't run off a textbook or a sort of playbook down in Tasmania, and that's what kind of makes it a really cool and interesting place to make wine.
Now this wine does see some oak as well as malolactic fermentation.
Yeah, it does. So it's not a lot of new oak in the Devil's Corner. As I said, quite a bit of stainless steel, really looking to just let that fruit and acidity express itself. Obviously still building some layers of complexity and texture into the wine. So there is malolactic fermentation. It's pretty important in Tassie with Chardonnay to do malolactic fermentation. We're not looking for a really overtly creamy or buttery influence of malolactic fermentation. We're just looking to tame the acidity. And that's pretty important in the Chardonnay styles. And then, some barrel maturation and some barrel fermentation, particularly in older oak in this one, to give those layers of texture and complexity.
So growing season, would you guys be, obviously Champagne, but Chablis, obviously looking Chardonnay, still wine, Chablis, more that, but the key differences is malolactic fermentation and the barrel aging.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, but stylistically, and we probably started closer to a Chablis style, and it's probably evolved a little bit in the Devil's Corner core range Chardonnay. And then there's the introduction of a little bit more malolactic fermentation and oak these days, just sort of building extra layers of complexity into that wine.
Perfect. Well, let's jump into our second Chardonnay.
So the Resolution Chardonnay, so things get a bit different here in terms of winemaking approach. Obviously, we're going back a couple of vintages to start with, but when I talked with the Devil's Corner core range about just letting that fruit express itself, a lot of stainless steel, we move into the Resolution range. This is 100% hand-picked. It's all fermented. It's whole bunch pressed. It's all fermented in barrel. There'll be some selected wine yeast used, but a lot of the fermentation will be indigenous wild yeast fermentation. The wine goes through, if we go through malolactic fermentation, most of it does. That'll all be done in barrel. There's aging on the yeast lees in barrel. So we're starting to build those more traditional Chardonnay characteristics in on top of the quality fruit to start with. But as we see in this wine, a lot more creaminess, those cashew notes from aging on lees, the sort of nougat, nutty oak influence. I think the Resolution Chardonnay was about 25% new oak, 25 to 30% new oak. So that new oak influence is starting to come into this wine as well. So this is it's a more classical expression of premium Chardonnay. 2019, I think you've got the 19 resolution Chardonnay, am I correct with that?
Yep.
Cool. So 2019 was actually a fantastic year in Tassie. I've talked just about all those challenges. 2019 was one of those years that actually fell into place pretty well for us in terms of climatically. We had moderate yields and we had really good weather right through the harvest period, which was great. But it enabled us to pick things right at the optimum time. It wasn't a rush vintage. It was just one of those ones that flowed out really well. So the quality of the 2019 wines have been very, very good. It was probably a slightly warmer year, so maybe slightly more generous in wine style than a couple of the years that follow it. But really happy with the way that the 2019's wines have pulled together.
Now both of these are from both of your vineyard ranges, right? Both the north and the east coast.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, what we've done with Chardonnay when we started growing Chardonnay in Tassie, we probably didn't have a thorough understanding of our particular blocks, various clones. Clonal influence on both Chardonnay and Pinot is really, really important. We're exceptionally lucky in Tasmania that when those vineyards were originally planted, one of the objectives was planting, particularly the vineyard in the Tamar, was actually experimenting with a whole range of clones. So clonal diversity is one of the challenges that a lot of wine regions have. They get a particular favourite clone and plant it heavily. We've actually got quite a range of clones, and also it was sort of depicted in that flyover. We've got a lot of small blocks with slightly different aspects in terms of their angles and slopes and those sort of things. So we've got the ability to produce quite a range of microclimates and clonal sort of matches and conditions. So when we started down in Tasmania, we found it really hard with Chardonnay actually to tame the acidity and to get layers of complexity and flavour into Chardonnay without it being just too grapefruit and citrus driven. And the wines were perhaps a little bit simple in going back a decade or so. What we've done now through a combination of picking individual blocks or sub-blocks, clones and side aspects, we've been able to get a lot more layers of flavour and complexity into those wines. But we do tend to, with the Chardonnay, we do tend to sort of lean on both regions because we can get some just different aspects from those two sites. So that you'll see with the Chardonnay wines here, both vineyards expressing themselves, and in the Pinot, in the resolution and Tamar Ridge Pinot, when we get to that at the end of the tasting, they tend to be a little bit more site specific, vineyard specific.
There's one of them, obviously, with having, the variation in clones and aspects and the two different regions that have different, sub microclimates. Does any one region dominate for Chardonnay versus Pinot Noir when you're looking at blending from the two different locations?
I think what we've learnt over the last few years in particular is having those two vineyards, even though as the crow flies, they're not that far apart and you just saw a flyover, they can behave extremely differently vintage to vintage. So we've come off there's the El Nino and La Nina sort of global climatic sort of patterns and conditions. The East Coast vineyard in a El Nino pattern tends to be quite very, very dry. We get very low rainfall there and dry, warmer sort of conditions. In a La Nina pattern, we have rainfall coming in from the east, and it actually there's a mountain range that we flew over on the way before we get to our East Coast vineyard. Typically what happens in a standard sort of in a drier climatic pattern is rain falls on the western side of Tasmania, gets trapped by the mountains or dumps on the mountains, and by the time it gets to the East Coast, the air's very dry and we don't get any rainfall. It actually reverses in a La Nina pattern, and we get rainfall and cooler winds and cooler temperatures on the East Coast and that actually kind of gets trapped by the mountains and hangs around there. So we found that having 2 different sites has given us a lot of versatility in terms of different seasonal conditions. And it's another one of those things it's adapting to the region. I must admit, through this tasting, I'm conscious, I don't want to make it sound like it's too hard to grow grapes down there. I think it's that what I'm trying to get across is the exciting challenge of leaning into that stuff, and how how interesting and emerging the region actually is. But on edge it is. Like not everyone can just plant a vineyard and make some great wine in Tasmania. And there are other parts. There's probably other parts of the world where people can produce a reasonable bottle of wine out of grapes with less knowledge about exactly the site that they're working on. Tasmania catches you out, so that's where we're really passionate about understanding our site and getting the most out of it.
All right, we ready. One of the questions I'll have is kind of about the geology and soil types, but maybe as we jump into our Pinot Noirs, we can touch on that as well.
Cool. Yeah, so let's get into the Devil's Corner Pinot Noir. So this is probably, it's quite a change actually, going from a 2019, even though we've been looking at Chardonnay, but from a 2019 vintage to a 2020 vintage. I talked about 2019, fantastic year. We're going to go back to the 19 on the Resolution and Tamar Ridge Reds in a minute. 2020 was also a fantastic year in terms of quality, but quite a different year. It was a much cooler year. And so we had to adapt quite a bit in terms of the way that we made these 2020 wines, and they're a little bit lighter in structure than the 2019s. So this Pinot Noir, just like the core range of Chardonnay, is really about bright, pure fruit expression. One of the things we do with winemaking in the Devil's Corner range, which is a little bit unique, we use a lot of air to manipulate our ferments. So traditionally, people will either pump over to mix the fermenting must and skins, or they'll hand plunge, or various combinations of those things. For the Devil's Corner core Pinot, we tend to like to ferment in slightly larger format fermenters, and we use air to manipulate our ferments rather than any pump overs and the likes. Air is actually a really interesting and unique tool in winemaking. We need to be really careful about when we apply it, but done really well during fermentation, it keeps the yeast extremely healthy. The yeast need oxygen to grow and to ferment the wine, and it's a really gentle way of mixing the juice and fermenting must. So it's much less extractive than pump overs or hand plunging. And essentially what we do is during the ferment, while the ferment's all nice and active, we inject through these little micro sinters, we inject air into the bottom of the fermenter. That causes a whole discharge of CO2, activity of yeast and all those things, and a rumbling effect. And you literally turn the juice from the bottom of the tank gently over the top of the skins, but without any actual physical manipulation. So you're not extracting bitter tannins out of grape seeds. There's a much more sort of gentle extraction of things. And that's how we like to produce the Devil's Corner Pinot, in this style that is very vibrant. You see a lot of perfume in this wine, a lot of crunchy cherry and cranberry sort of notes. It's got a savoury character through the palate, but it's not overly extractive, and it hasn't been built. This wine hasn't been built around oak and things like that, which we'll get to that in the other range. This is built around, again, fruit purity, and my philosophy there is when you're growing in the really cool region and you're growing some extremely high quality grapes that taste really good, let's express that in the bottle and see a Pinot that's perfumed and looks just like the variety. as opposed to too much winemaking artifact.
I pulled up, and maybe you can explain it better because I was struggling to understand it. For those of us that do like to get like super geeky, Tasmanian viticulture, soils, and geology. Obviously, you look at that heat map of all the different soil types and things like that. Maybe kind of talk us through the unique aspects of the terroir and the impact on soil and drainage and things like that for the different regions as well for these grapes.
Yeah, it's an interesting one in Tassie, in that the soil types themselves vary quite a bit. We're not a region across our vineyard sites. We're not a region that is particularly focused around a terra rossa soil like the Coonawarra in the mainland of Australia, or something that has a particular theme that really dominates the region. What it is for us, as I talked about, the main thing we would focus on with that soil variability is understanding the best match of variety, clone, and soil type. And we've evolved quite our vineyards over the, we're constantly evolving them in terms of changing out. There are a number of blocks that have not performed particularly strongly because there's a bit of a mismatch between soil type and clone and variety. So we're evolving our vineyards and replanting sections as we go and learn more. There's some areas in Tasmania as well that are quite through the soil types. There's some pretty variable areas with low nutrient levels and reasonably low vigor. So they can be the areas where you get into some heavier sort of clays or less sort of topsoil. So one of the other aspects we've been doing is using precision viticulture to essentially map vine health and vigor. And you use drone imagery and things like that to do that, and computer sort of programs to provide some mapping. And we're actually able to, I haven't got a slide in this deck. I've sometimes got a slide that sort of shows this, but we're actually then able to see right across the vineyard, essentially a map, a vigor map, a vine health map. And that shows, as much as anything, that shows things like drainage and soil type, and they're interconnected. And in those areas, that enables us then to plug that into smarts in a computer when we're on a tractor, and we can spread mulch into areas of low vigor and avoid spreading mulch in areas of high vigor within a row on a vineyard, all controlled by a computer PLC based on this precision viticulture sort of imagery. And that's one of the things we've been working on for the last 4 or 5 years. So really trying to even out variability in soil type and soil depth and vigor by introducing additional organic matter and things like that into our soil profile in the areas that need it most, and also understanding things like drainage and stuff within blocks, and if we've got wetter areas that might be impacting vine health, putting in little areas of subsurface drainage and the likes.
You're talking to a lot of folks in the Midwest that understand a lot about corn suitability rating and combines that measure the exact bushels per whatever and dispense fertilizer and everything else based on much of the same things you're talking about. One of the questions we did have is any concerns of oxidization when using the air during the fermentation process, or is that mostly just to sort of spark more of the fermentation itself?
It's an excellent question because it is something you have to be particularly careful with when you're using air. During a fermentation, you can't use air. You can't use air at the wrong time because you will oxidize the wine. During an active fermentation, the yeast are producing so much carbon dioxide as part of the process that it's almost scientifically impossible to push into an oxidative environment by introducing air. You just can't get enough volume of air in You may be able to if you're using pure oxygen. But we're not doing that. We're using air. We're using sort of filtered compressed air. So during the active fermentation, it works really well. Where you need to be careful about it is too early before you've got active fermentation underway, or too late in the process where you could be introducing some oxidative characters. So that's part of the science of understanding that fermentation.
Are there other regions that typically use that process when making their Pinot Noir as well?
I think using air as a tool in fermentation is not a new thing, and it is something that that other regions, other winemakers use. For us, it's just a significant part of that Devil's Corner Pinot style. If you're trying to make a fruit expressive wine in a slightly lighter frame, there can be quite a bit of tannin in Tasmania, and it's easy for those wines to dry out and start to look a bit firm and a bit dry. So for us, it's really about getting the fruit expression out with a controlled level of tannin, and we want these wines to be able to be consumed while they're young and fresh, but also to age for a reasonable period of time as well. So balancing the tannin, we found the best ways to use the air.
Well, the other thing you kind of notice, and I don't know if anybody else has the tasting notes up, is despite having lower than typical alcohol, when compared to their counterparts from around the world, whether it's Chardonnay or Pinot Noir, these still have an incredibly broad structure and very vibrant fruit flavors, without having to balance out the higher alcohol level that you might get in a Pinot Noir from California that might be pushing 13.5 or 14 or even higher than that anymore, which is kind of cool as well. Are we ready to jump through to our second Chardonnay here, the Resolution?
Second Pinot Noir, yeah, the Resolution.
Yep.
Excellent. So again, like we talked about the Chardonnay, quite a different pivot on a winemaking point of view here. This is when we get into the Resolution, and it's the same concept for the Tamar Ridge, a much more traditional Pinot Noir winemaking sort of profile. So this is small batch fermentation. It's all in open fermenters. We move away from things like the air, and we're manipulating this fruit with hand plunging. We also use, increasingly we use pump overs to control fermentation. We use peristaltic pumps. So we've got these pumps that are designed to gently handle pumping solids, so they can move whole berries through the pump without splitting the berry and damaging the berry and causing extraction and manipulation from grape seeds and things like that we're trying to avoid. So traditional sort of fermentation, then they're basket pressed. So again, on a small batch scale, straight into barrel, and to finish off fermentation in barrel. And then we do a fairly traditional delayed malolactic fermentation. So we'll sort of winter the wines after alcoholic fermentation and just keep them well topped. And then in spring, we do our malolactic fermentation as the winery warms up. And we find that delayed malolactic fermentation creates a little bit of aldehyde bonding for the color stability of the wines, color and tannin stability of the wines. So that's part of our style. But you're seeing all of these are fermented or are finished and matured in barrel, typically about 10 to 15% new oak, 15% new oak. I think the 2019 was 16% new from memory. So new oak and oak influence is playing a role in the wines. They're not overtly oaky, but they're all matured in oak. So a much more classic traditional premium Pinot Noir style, and quite a deviation from what we do for the Devil's Core range, but producing two different styles of wine. The Resolution wine, Devil's Corner Resolution wine, has an East Coast to Tasmania focus, and the Tamar Ridge, when we get to that, is a Tamar Valley focus. So that's the starting point. I'll let you have a quick taste.
Do you run into issues, because it is so cold, with the wine's total acidity being too high and having to make adjustments during the fermentation process, or no?
Not typically. We're pretty, again, selecting the right blocks and clones becomes important. And that's part of what we're actually looking at. Acidities, we probably look at acidity, we look at acidity and flavor more than we look at sugar level or Beaumont bricks, whatever we're talking about, when it actually comes to harvest decisions in Tassie. And you just referred to the fact that the Devil's Corner core range from the 2020 vintage was 12.5% alcohol. I think the next two wines are 13 on the label. I think they're about 13.2, 13.3 or something like that. In terms of the exact figure. So slightly riper in 2019, but that was the season as much as anything. And if we've got the right flavour maturity and the right acid development at 12.5%, that's where we'll pick. We're not targeting a particular kind of sugar level. So site, block, canopy management, crop load, all of those sort of things are balancing out to ensure that we get that right balance. We do, depending on the block, we do a bit of leaf plucking for fruit exposure, and that helps with acidity management as well as we go through the ripening sort of process.
Okay.
What we'll see with both of the next two wines is there's a bit of a mix of clones. And I talked about the importance of clone usage in Pinot, and across our range, and it's particularly evident in the Tamar Ridge range, where there's half a dozen smaller batch products that are individual clone or particular themes that come through in the Tamar Ridge range. But with the resolution and the Tamar Ridge estate, what we're really trying to do is produce really complete and balanced profiles of wine. So the resolution Pinot is about 60% of what we call the richer clones. So we've got Pommard and MV6 and Able clone. So they're thicker skin clones that produce a bit more color, a bit more tannin density and richer style wines. And then about 40% from lighter clones, so 777 and 115. 115 is increasingly quite a versatile clone, but 777 in particular is a thin-skinned, much lighter, but really perfumed and fragrant clone that gives us an aromatic lift, but not necessarily the concentration and weight. So this is an example of using a balance of those clones to produce a wine that we think is really balanced and great expression of Pinot. And we've got other examples in our portfolio where we push particularly down one focus clone to produce a wine of a certain style.
What's the I think you mentioned, I think a number that sticks in my mind was like 20 years when you're talking about vineyard age or vine age. Is it average-ish, or are we talking younger vines, newer vines for some of these wines?
It's about 20 years average age at the Tamar site, the Canis, the north of the island. A little bit younger than that on the east coast, but some of our plantings are younger than that again. So it really depends on the block. Things like Able clone have not been in the mainland of Australia or Tasmania for particularly long. Able clone is a clone that's been used pretty successfully in New Zealand, and but it's a richer and more sort of generous clone. So sometimes the vines are a little bit younger than that, and vine age for me it's about balance and quality. Like sometimes you can get some fantastic wines out of first crop. Often you don't get the best wines out of your second, third, fourth, fifth kind of crop, because you're starting to get vines go through a bit of an ugly teenager phase that they don't sort of behave quite as well. But once things sort of settle down, you're up and running. And in Tasmania as well, it often takes us 3 or 4 years before we actually get our first crop. Like things grow slow down there. So the vines they probably mature earlier in their life in some ways, because they don't race up to the wire and grow a whole lot in their first 12 months like they can in warmer regions and in particularly sort of fertile soils and stuff like that in other parts of the country.
Well, I think one of the things I started off with saying maybe probably wasn't the best description of the region, right? Obviously I said, hey, it's a newer region. I think it's more newer for us in that we're starting to see a lot more still wine production, but it's been producing, obviously it's had vines and been producing wine for a number of years, because 20 years isn't anything to laugh at.
No, that's right. And that's, that'd be some of the older vines. There's a lot of the region is reasonably emerging. And as I alluded to, Australia's 4% of the wine production. This is 1% of Australia. So it's very small, but it is growing. And I think that, it'll continue to sort of evolve. The great thing about that is that there's a lot of technology out now to understand, microclimates of specific sites. There's a lot more knowledge of clones. There's access to a wider range of planting material. There's all of these things that sort of go on now, so that the vines that are planted in Tasmania, and as that region continues to develop, are probably likely to produce better wine than some of the plantings that were done on mass in regions, 10, 20 years ago, when people planted what they could get access to.
Yeah. Well, and even going back, looking at that heat map, there's not a lot of other cool climate regions within Australia to be able to grow, this style of Chardonnay or Pinot Noir. I know there's like one region that's known for making Riesling, which is obviously a cool climate grape whose name escapes me. I think there's another one for like Semillon, but then aside from that, there's not a lot of regions that jump out and say, ooh, I'm going there for Pinot Noir, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Cool. We're jumping to a different brand now, right?
We are. We're jumping to Tamar Ridge. And I'm getting a little conscious of time. I won't keep you guys too long, but I've probably talked from a winemaking point of view. When I talk to Devil's Corner Resolution, we're talking very similar philosophies for Tamar Ridge. And as it's had, we're looking at the same vintage here, the 2019 vintage. So I've talked a bit about that. Where in the Devil's Corner Resolution, we've got an East Coast focus for the Tamar Ridge. We've got a Tamar Valley focus. So this is a wine that's made up in the northern part of the state. Tends to be a little lighter in colour, a little bit more perfumed, and perhaps slightly more classic Pinot frame from the Tamar, as opposed to the Devil's Corner Resolution, which has maybe a bit more fruit generosity and mid-palate weight. This is a slightly finer structured Pinot, or more classically structured Pinot. Again, the winemaking philosophy is very similar on these. As it works out, the clonal mix is not wildly different in these two wines. That's a factor of how it's turned out for this particular year. So it's actually a really cool example of looking at the same vintage in two different parts of the state. We get the winemaking side of things and the clonal material in the makeup and the oak percentage and the whole bunch percentage and all of those things are pretty similar. The coopers that we've used for the barrels will be reasonably similar. So this probably talks a little bit to the differences between the two sites in a really strong year.
Well, the other thing I always like to do is I like to look at websites as I do this to get more information and more questions. And I'm getting a little bit upset that I haven't seen the sparkling wine or the Riesling or the Sauv Blanc or the Pinot Gris. So you guys are making a lot of other things too, right?
We are. Yeah, that's right. And this is today's tastings Chardonnay Noir focus, and that's as we've grown these brands, one of our challenges has been having enough wine to service the market. So as we've started exporting and working in the US and other parts of the world, it's been getting access to enough material as well. It's a reasonably limited and finite resource in Tasmania. It's not like we can sort of just. It takes a while to grow new grapes, and the region itself is reasonably small. So we're growing it with quite a focus around premium Chardonnay and Pinot Noir production, and also sparkling. But obviously the parts of our portfolio that are that are in the States at the moment, and the starting to grow is the Chardonnay and Pinot Noir.
Well, I know who to bug. I know who to bug for all the cool stuff. So I shall bug them later. Obviously they make, I think this Pinot Noir we utilized in our Iowa. I think we used it in our Iowa Premium Club as well, but they make a couple different ranges of their Pinot Noir as well, right? Or you all do?
We do. Yeah, we do. So this is the estate range of Tamar Ridge, and as I mentioned before, we've got within this brand, we've got reserve, we've got a reserve product, we've got a number of smaller products that we sell just through our cellar door and club, domestically and in single block wines, and we've got a research series one, which is pretty cool. We like to try and think outside of the box and see if we can break the logic of winemaking with some of the things that we do there. So we've done things like pick fruit and leave the bins of fruit in the vineyard, not even bring them into the winery, and ferment them out there. So no temperature control, just put a cover over them, go out and give them a hand plunge when we think about it. And the idea there is that they've gone through a really truly unique wild fermentation with the yeast that's been found naturally in the vineyard, as opposed to any influence from the winery at all. And then if it's really cold, they have a really cold ferment. If it's warm, they have a warm ferment. All of that sort of thing. So we've done work like that, and those sort of trial things end up making their way into influencing the wines we've been tasting today. But sometimes when we've got standouts, we bottle them off as a small volume sort of curio thing. So the Tamar Ridge, I think the Tamar Ridge range at the moment's got about 7 Pinot Noirs under that brand.
I was looking at them and reading the carbonic fermentation variations of the research series, and every single year being a little bit different and nuanced based on the techniques that you guys use. So, well, excellent. Yeah. I think maybe we'll bump to our last wine. We have plenty of time, so there's no rush. We can definitely take our time and go through that one, then answer questions. As people have questions, they can jump into the chat as well.
Perfect. No worries. So we change brands again here. We actually we'll change back to the mainland for the home of the brand, but then this particular wine is sourced from New Zealand, so it's quite a change of pace. And I think you've got the 2019. Is it 2019 that we've got of the Otago Pinot there?
Let me look here. Yep. It looks like we have the 2021 on the text sheets. I'm not sure the vintage. Maybe
okay.
One of the stores can have them right in front of me.
So Innocent Bystander brand, Innocent Bystander, it's based in the Yarra Valley. So Yarra Valley is one of the oldest wine regions in the mainland of Australia. It's about an hour out of Melbourne. It's actually quite a cool area on the mainland. And again, a very strong focus around Pinot Noir and Chardonnay out of the Yarra. So the Yarra Valley is our home for this brand. But part of the brand has been very much about identifying parcels of wine that make exceptional, or regions that make exceptional examples of a particular wine style. So in the US, we've got, under the Innocent Bystander brand, we've got a Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, and anyone that consumes Sauvignon Blanc right around the world tends to have fairly high recognition of the Marlborough region. So they've done a fantastic job with that variety and recognition of that variety. And then further down south of the South Island of Tasmania is a region called Central Otago. For anyone that's not familiar with that region, that's one of the most southern wine regions in the Southern Hemisphere. And it's pretty similar, like on a latitude point of view, it's pretty similar to the northern part of Oregon. So it gives you a little bit of context there. It's a really, really cool region as well because it's so far south. So we're obviously at the opposite this side of the world. But it's basically the region of Central Otago. It's an inland area. The soils are there's a lot of stony sort of impact to the soils. They're essentially old glacial soils with a lot of stone. So because it's so far south, they get a lot of sunshine hours through summer, And the soil and sunshine combination really allows for the soils to heat up during the day. That provides protection to the vines over the really cold nights. And you actually get this fabulous sort of combination of refined with bright acidity, but quite concentrated forms of Pinot Noir grown in an area that is actually really cool when you look at the climatic data. So yeah, Central Otago is a pretty special sort of place. It's one of the most picturesque places to go to as well for anyone traveling down to Australia or New Zealand. At any stage, I implore you to go to New Zealand and check out Queenstown and that area. It's absolutely stunning. Mountain ranges and the likes, but the wines are pretty fabulous there as well. So we work, obviously I'm not based in New Zealand, but we work really closely with a little family business there to help us make the wine. So I craft what we want to do and supervise the process, and then lean on their assistance to make these wines. At Central Otago, everything's hand-picked. For this wine, we use more whole bunch influence than we do in Tasmania. So we're up around 30% whole bunch, whereas in Tasmania, the wines we've tasted so far are probably more around the 10% whole bunch influence. And the generosity of fruit in Central Otago enables you to add a bit of additional whole bunch. We want those wines to still have a really clear Pinot influence and a lift and a vibrancy and a complexity that can come from fermenting with whole bunches. So that's why the whole bunch influence is in there, and you don't end up with a herbaceous or a too lightly framed wine from doing it in Central. So that's essentially the winemaking brief down there.
I know we featured this actual wine in our wine club pre-COVID, I want to say. And it was one of those wines that customers would come in and repeatedly in the Corville store be like, "What's your favorite Pinot Noir?" And it'd be one of two, right? It would be one of the two. Inevitably, I would go to be like, "Hey, I want to take a bottle at home," but I sold all of it to everybody because I kept telling them it was my favorite, and they kept buying it out, which is really, really great. Couple questions here that I know we have. I know, was it 2020 when they had the fires, mainland Australia? Did Tasmania have any of the issues or smoke taint or anything as a result of that?
No, we haven't in Tasmania. Luckily, we've had a couple of seasons where we had some fires actually in Tasmania. Back in 2016, there were some fires around, but far enough away from us. In being based in Victoria myself, it's my homeland. There's been quite a bit of work that we've done with the industry on understanding the impact of smoke, and I know that it's something that's impacted wineries in the States, particularly in California, over numerous summers as well. So understanding smoke taint and smoke impact is something we're pretty familiar with, but luckily we've had no negative influence, or we've had no losses due to smoke taint in Tasmania, which is good.
Ageability. Somebody asked specifically about sort of the ageability of this last wine, Innocent Bystander, but maybe talk briefly about what you view as sort of the ageability of some of these Pinot Noirs.
Yeah. I think out of the entire mainland, or out of Australia or New Zealand, Tasmania and Central Otago are probably the two regions that have the best age-worthy or age capability. And that's probably because of the intensity of fruit and the tannin profile you get out of these wines. The Central Otago wine ages particularly well. I've looked at that. In the Tassie range, the Devil's Corner wines, the core wines, because we use less oak, less tannin extraction and things like that, those wines are, they're designed to express fruit. They're probably generally best consumed while they're younger. They do age and they become quite interesting. They become quite savoury in time with age, but I think they're best consumed. We're on the 2020 vintage of the Pinot at the moment, which is drinking in a lovely sort of window. But that's not necessarily a wine that I'd be looking to put down I'd be, consuming that. Whereas the Resolution and Tamar Ridge wines, particularly the Tamar Ridge, they age really quite well. The Resolution we've only been making since about 2016, so I haven't seen any really old examples of that. But there's no reason to think that wine's not going to age well as well. So that becomes a personal preference thing, obviously, as to whether you like the primary fruit characteristics or some of those secondary characteristics that develop with age. But certainly in the Resolution, Tamar Ridge, and Innocent Bystander, Otago wine range, they're age worthy if that's what people are interested in.
Where, I guess, last question here is, where are you sort of in the season, as far as planting and harvesting and all that fun stuff right now?
Yeah, so we just finished harvest. It was one of the latest harvests actually for many years. It was, I talked about it in Tassie, but across most wine growing regions in Australia, it was a wetter, cooler spring this year, so a later start, and generally a reasonably mild summer. Good conditions actually through most of the ripening period. So from a quality point of view, it was a good vintage, but a late vintage, probably 3 or 4 weeks later than average across most regions. So we've just finished harvest actually in last week, whereas we'd normally finish sort of end of April in Tassie. So we probably finish a week or so later there, and mainland Australia we finished probably 3 weeks later than normal.
There's my guy. Just scrolled through. I didn't realize Chris Rose snuck into the chat or in here. Might have to start. Might have to start all over again.
I didn't want to give you any crap about asking for wines we can never get. So.
Oh, I always like. Well, I'm not as bad as my brother, but we definitely all like to ask for the things that we can't have, so to speak, and we will definitely keep asking either way.
And we keep trying to get them in for you.
Mm-hmm. Answer is no if you don't ask.
It's true.
I've been taught that over and over again. Well, I'll tell you what. I mean, this has been an amazing tasting. It's always great to learn about a region like this, and most importantly, learn that if you're a cool kid, you got to call it Tassie, not Tasmania. So as you're talking to your friends and you're saying, hey, this wonderful Pinot Noir from Tassie, we can use that terminology as well. But friendly reminder to everybody, we brought these wines in for this event. These are wines that we can continue to carry, but I know all of the stores brought them in for this. We appreciate you guys coming in. Grab them, buy them, take them home with you. As I said, a few of these have always been some of my favorites. Definitely that Innocent Bystander, as well as I think the Sauv Blanc has always been one of my favorite New Zealand Sauv Blancs. But they've always had some amazing wines in their portfolio, and Chris has always made some great connections for us, and we appreciate Joel, your time, sharing your passion, sharing your information, sharing your knowledge, and most importantly, sharing the wines that you create. They're amazing. All right, Chris, did you have anything? I know you haven't had a chance to talk, which is
no. I mean, Joel obviously is the expert in Tasmania, but it's been great to have these wines. We're about to get our third vintage. Pinot just landed. Third vintage of Chardonnay comes in June, July, and it's been, I think we bothered them for about 5 years before they finally caved. They just didn't have enough production for us to work with it, and now that we do, we've been selling through every vintage very rapidly. And honestly, it's because of WineStyles that it's in Iowa in the first place, because it wasn't a market that was really on our radar to open up right out of the way. But with you, Brian, and I talked about it, it made a great fit for us to bring in. So these wines you won't find anywhere outside of this 12 states that we have them in. There's we get a whopping 6,000 six-packs of each of the Chardonnay and the Pinot for just Devil's Corner, and then less than a couple hundred cases of the other stuff.
Well, I know Iowa has sold out routinely of the Innocent Bystander Pinot Noir as well as the Sauv Blanc. So I don't know if that's still an issue, but those are always go-tos as well as all of these. So, well, we appreciate, as always, you guys hooking us up with all the cool things, and Brian, I'll be in touch for the other cool stuff that we want. All right.
Yeah. And Joel, I hope to catch up with you when you're out here in a couple of weeks. So travel safe, buddy.
Perfect. With
great.
that, we will sign off. Stay tuned. I know we have, I think we're taking a few months off in the summer here for our local stores to do some local planning, but we'll hook back up in September with our National Winery Spotlight. That doesn't mean that we don't have events. All the stores are still doing their education events, their pickup parties. They're going to be doing some locally programmed events with some distributors and winemakers that will be in town to sort of bring it back home and have more of a hands-on basis for the next few months. So with that, I'll sign off. Thanks again, and enjoy good wine. See you guys.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks, everyone.